So the caption says, what the? This is lemonade. Where's my culture of amoebic dysentery? I did my graduate work in a lab with parasitic amoebas that eat your brain. We'll talk about those a little bit today. But first, we're going to deal with the term parasites. I'm a parasite biologist. But it doesn't always mean the same thing. Is it some... now, to a parasite biologist, typically we're dealing with some sort of animal. It may be a single-celled animal, so the term animal is a little broad, that lives in some sort of larger organism. Bigger animal, bigger plant. But some people consider viruses to be parasites because there's something small that lives off of something big, and sometimes bacteria are considered that way. Typically, that's not the classic definition of parasite. So from here on, we're going to be dealing with animals, although the first group is technically not in the animal kingdom, it's in its own separate kingdom. But we're not getting that far into biology for that to really matter. But I am going to put the term parasites up. And we're going to start with the group that are called protozoans. Little single cells, but not bacterial cells. These are cells that are more like our cells, that have a nucleus and all sorts of fancy doodads in them. A lot of these guys have flagella, the long wiggly things, or cilia, or pseudopods that they can crawl with. And there are a number of protozoan parasites of living things. I'm basically just going to go through a list of some kind of either important ones or interesting ones. And of course, you're stuck with my definition of interesting. So these are examples. I've noticed on the TV prescription commercials, there's a prescription drug called Jardiance, which people in these companies are supposed to check to see whether their words are going to be confusing with anything. And I don't know if somebody knew that Giardia was a parasite. I don't know that taking a pill named after a parasite would necessarily be a great thing. Giardia is a very, very, very unusual parasite. It lives all over the world. That alone is somewhat unusual. It can live in the intestinal systems of almost any kind of mammal, so any kind of furry creature, including us. And I talked earlier when we talked about disease evolution that our digestive systems are pretty different. Ours from a deer, from a pure meat eater, is our digestive chemistry is very, very different. But these guys, they live in all of these guys, and they do. So Giardia is passed into water. We'll get there. These things follow cycles. So we'll start, you got to step onto the cycle somewhere. We're going to step on the cycle of Giardia in the water. And so you drink out of a stream, or you walk into a pond and stir the bottom up a little bit because they would have sunk to the bottom of the pond. But if you walk in, it's pretty shallow, and you stir it up. And you drink, they're in a little capsule called a cyst. They're just kind of waiting for something to drink them. So they're taken in with drinking water. And they can be carried by all sorts of mammals. I know years ago when I used to go hiking, you'd go hiking up in the Adirondacks, and you'd see a stream, and I'd be thinking about drinking water out of the stream. Now typically, parasites and other kinds of things pass human to human. So in order for the stream to be contaminated, it would need to be contaminated with human wastes. Well, it turns out, if it's contaminated with any kind of mammal wastes, so it could be deer, could be mice, could be bears, could be all sorts of different things, then you could be picking those up, and this is what they do. The little casings go through your stomach. The stomach acid doesn't disrupt them. They get into your intestines, and you can't digest them in your intestines, and they pop open. So these emerge in your intestine. And they reproduce. They make lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of babies. They're living off of your food, right? Your intestine's full of nutrients. And they're making copies and copies and copies, asexual reproduction. Now, a giardia nope, that's not a giardia. A giardia is shaped a little bit like a racquetball racket. I've drawn the outside of it because the picture didn't show up too well. Under the microscope, if you stain them, they kind of look a little bit like a cross-eyed tennis racket. I'm going to move this to the side so you can see it. I don't know how well this shows up going through the video, but these are pretty good examples of what you can see when you stain them. So this has been smeared on a slide and stained with a special stain in order to make them show up. And so this is what they look like this way. They're cup-shaped the other way. And what they do is that they attach themselves over the little microvilli projections you have on your intestinal lining. And so they just coat the inside of your intestines. Now here's something about your digestive system. Your digestive system, what's in your digestive system is kind of sort of outside of you. And your immune system can't really get at things that are in your digestive system, because if they throw antibodies out there, you digest the antibodies. If they throw white blood cells to fight it, you kill the white blood cells. They can't stand being digested. So stuff that can itself survive being digested can live happily in your digestive system. And your immune system there isn't a lot your immune system can do. But it will try. It will detect the invasion. The linings of the intestine will inflame, so you'll get pain. And they'll start to cramp. Why? They're trying to push everything out. They're cramping and pushing. They're cramping and squeezing and pushing. So you get cramps, and as you push stuff down, it pushes it into the colon, where you're supposed to pull the water out of your food, except there's too much of a flow, and everything just goes right out. So you get a bout of very explosive diarrhea. This does very little to get rid of these guys. They're stuck on the sides. They can coat your intestines so much that it interferes with your own ability to absorb food. Here's the thing. They're not really that dangerous. Unless you're already sick, or you're very young, or you're very old. It's annoying, it's painful, it's not fun for a few days, but it isn't gonna likely kill you. Around here, it's classically called beaver fever. Even though you're probably not catching it through beavers. Well, why is it called beaver fever then? When folks first came into New York and New England and North America, you're hauling all your stuff in and you want to start a settlement. Well, one thing you definitely need all year round in a settlement is water. So you're either going to set up near a fairly large body of flowing water like a river. You don't want to pick too small a stream because you can't be sure you can depend on that. Or a body of still water, a lake or a pond. Well, pretty much the only lakes or the ponds that exist have a blockage of outflow. That's what fills the water up. Around here, most of the ponds and rivers actually have artificial dams on them, and the ones that don't have beaver dams on them. Well, when people first got here as settlers, there were no pre-built dams. So if there was a pond, chances are it was a beaver pond. And they would settle, and they would start to drink the water and they would get sick. So they blamed the beavers. So that's where the name comes from. This diarrhea is passing the capsules, the cysts. So it got in, reproduced like crazy, producing fairly nasty symptoms and passing a whole bunch of its offspring out of your body with a decent amount of moisture with them. Anything out, we talk about, what does a bear do in the woods? There's that old expression. Well, they do, and they can pass Giardia doing that. Anything out there that's taking a dump in the woods, all you need is a little bit, actually a decent amount of rain to soften it up and wash the Giardia into the nearest drainage situation, into the nearest stream, onto the nearest pond, and that's how it passes from animal to animal to animal. It requires outwash. Now, the Giardia will not do this indefinitely. It's not good for it, right? It would kill you. It would dehydrate you if it did this indefinitely. So after a week, 10 days, you can go to the doctor and get Flagyl and kill it, but if you wait it out, you're going to feel better. They're not gone though, right? And you can't develop antibodies because they can't get at them. They can live in you a really long time, and that's what they'll do. But here's the tricky thing. If you keep drinking the water and take in more Giardia, the guys you already have, your own resident population, keeps the new guys from going nuts. So you don't get a bout of beaver fever every time you take a drink of water. You just have this population that's being replenished from the outside, that's making offspring and passing through your regular bowel movements and passing well enough to be passed amongst all the animals. You can go through all sorts of different animals. There's a lot of potential hosts. And if you say went camping and picked this up, and then you went back to your house and you were drinking city water where all of this stuff is supposed to be separated out. When they used to store water in Amsterdam in an open reservoir, I'm not sure it was. But anyway, they don't do that anymore. If you go back to your home where there's no contamination of the water, these guys are so mellow that without the influx, they will eventually deplete, and maybe 3 years down, you won't have any of them left. And then you lose their protection, is that you can get another bout of beaver fever. There is a related parasite that you get south of the border, Mexico, Central America, the northern part of South America. What does everybody say when you're gonna go visit something down there? They go, don't drink the water. Well, the locals can drink the water. Why can't you drink the water? They're dealing with a parasite that acts in a very similar way, but it's not a Giardia. In fact, it's not in the same group of protozoans. Instead of flagella that Giardia have, it has pseudopods. It's an amoeba. And just like the cartoon, now this one's different in that it doesn't exist in a whole bunch of different animals. It actually has to pass human to human, which if you think about it is not good news, because if you're picking this up from drinking the local water, it means the local water is contaminated with human wastes. And the amoeba from the human waste are getting into the next host that way. It has been eliminated in places where the water treatment is sufficient. When I was in graduate school, one of my jobs, every 6 months, we would get a container of water from Mexico City, from the Mexico City municipal system, and I had to check that for amoebas. And there weren't supposed to be any in there. So imagine checking a liter of water for microscopic organisms that aren't there. So you have to go, well, I didn't find any. But that was good news. They didn't want them in the water. But it's a very similar system where once you do have them in you, you'll get kind of sick. It's a little bit more dangerous as an illness. It's potentially can be more deadly. But most people, it just, they're very unhappy for a few days, and then they kind of are okay. But the resident amoebas keep you from getting sick again. That's why the locals can drink the water as long as they're continually exposed to it. So, two very different, unrelated parasites doing a very, very similar kind of thing. Now, I mentioned that the lab I worked in dealt with an amoeba that eats your brains. That's called primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. And is it any surprise that everybody calls it PAM? This one, I'm going to scare you, but very, very few cases occur. When they do across the whole United States, it usually makes news because it's such a weird disease. I remember a crawl on the bottom of one of the news stations a couple of summers ago as some kid in Florida got this. So it's big news because it's a very dramatic thing. Here's the downside. These amoebas are not really parasites. They're just pond amoebas, and they are all over the place. They're a type of species called Naegleria, very, very common. It's just that apparently, very rarely do they even have the ability to invade a human being. But here's what has to happen. You have to suck some, well, they're on the bottom of the ponds. You stir the water up, so now they don't swim, but they're stirred up. And you get some water up your nose. You know, you ever sucked water up your nose swimming, you know what you're talking about. And they adhere to the very top of the nasal epithelium. It goes up and it curves and goes down. Right at the top of the curve, they stick there, and they come in through it. Now that's your smelling patch, and it's connected by a whole bunch of nerves to your brain. Well, the rare case of them being able to invade that way, they will crawl up those nerves and get into the front part of your brain and start to reproduce and eat your brain. And you'll get some pretty bad headaches from this. And you go to the doctor and they'll go, you got a sinus problem. Well, no, I don't have sinus problems. Well, you got a migraine then. I've never had a migraine. Well, I guess you got a migraine now. They're not gonna know what's wrong with you because it happens too rarely. They aren't gonna, and the thing is too, if they went, oh, you've got Naegleria, have you made out a will? Because there isn't really, some people have survived this, but there isn't a reliable treatment for it. Is that one person survived it a few years ago, and for a while they were disseminating this treatment that they'd given them. And since then, other people have tried the treatment and found out it wasn't the treatment, that they just got lucky. And that for one reason or another, they didn't die of PAM. But typically, it'll consume your brain and it will kill you. There isn't a heck of a lot that you can do about it. There isn't any effective treatment. So the next time you're swimming, there have been cases where these things, they also pass through the air as cysts. It's unusual, but there has been a case of somebody who had no exposure to any kind of open water at all, who it's assumed had sucked a cyst up their nose just accidentally. It happened to be the cyst with the wrong variant in it, and they got PAM that way. But again, if I didn't work in a lab with this, where it was actually, the guy who worked with it was transferring samples, you know, about as far away from me as I am from this camera. But, you know, they don't jump, so I wasn't really worried about it. But it's a neat kind of disease. Trypanosomes, you'll have a chance to see these in the lab. Little wiggly guys, single cells, tiny guys. There are two major human diseases caused by trypanosomes. There's African sleeping sickness, where it does just enough damage to your brain that you kind of go, well, you kind of go asleep. You're not quite in a coma, technically, but you kind of just lay there and it's really hard to rouse you. These are picked up by tsetse flies in African sleeping sickness. They bite you and it passes the parasites. And of course, it's much easier to bite a sleeping person that doesn't wake up and not worry about getting swatted. So it benefits the parasite to, you know, it reproduces in the person that's sleeping, and then it needs more flies to carry it to the next hosts. So it causes sleeping sickness. In the Americas, the trypanosome causes something called Chagas disease, which if you look at Darwin, the evolution guy, who came to South America in his early 20s and then got progressively sicker through his 50s and 60s. If you look at his symptoms, it is very likely he had Chagas disease. This is before even Chagas named it, so nobody knew what it was. But it's very, very slow. And that presents a question. That was a question for a really long time. These are single cells, and they live in your blood and your tissue fluid, right next door to all of your immunity. How do they do that? How do you not fight them off? And what was discovered was that the molecules that you would make antibodies to come in two varieties on a trypanosome. On some of them, where the membrane is, there's actually a ditch, a depression that they have these molecules in, and your immune cells that are tasting for molecules to make antibodies to, they don't reach down into the ditches to pick those, so you don't develop antibodies to the things your system can't detect. The ones that it can't hide in a ditch because they do something that doesn't work if it's in a ditch, they actually change them. They'll produce one shape and use that for a while, and about the time your antibodies are about to mark them all for death, they make a new one. They go into their mix and match DNA closet and make a different shape that your antibodies don't attach to. Now you're gonna make antibodies to that. They can keep doing that for years and years and years and years. Why does that matter? Well, there have been a number of other diseases where it can persist in the human body for a long time, and it should be something that we can fight off. But the idea that antigens, the things we make antibodies to, could change purposely to evade immune response was just discovered in the trypanosomes. Remember I talked about escape mutants in HIV? That's what HIV is doing. It's changing its antigens in order to really expand its ability to infect your cells. It does, in the process, kill you. That's not really that good for it, but it's the same basic idea. You'll have a handout on malaria. Malaria is from a group of protozoans that are very tiny, almost bacterial sized, and they typically live inside other cells. They reproduce inside other cells, inside a bigger host usually, although they are sometimes parasites of other protozoans. So there's a whole bunch of these. It's in a big group called epicomplexans. You don't need to know that. They used to call them sporozoans. But I do want to talk a little bit about malaria because it's still a major issue in the world, and no one's been able to come up with a completely usable vaccine for it. Let me run you through malaria. Malaria and its group does what's called alternation of generations. This will come up in some of the later parasites as well, where in a typical life cycle, they have a sexual stage where they mix and match genes and come up with variation, and an asexual stage where they make lots and lots of copies. And usually these are copies of things that were successful in getting into the host, so they're making copies of successful forms. In asexual, they're mixing and matching genes of something that was successful, and so possibly increasing the success. Asexual reproduction happens in what's called the intermediate host. And sexual reproduction happens in what's called the final or definitive host. And sometimes there are vector hosts in between. Some things that do this go through a bunch of hosts, but you usually only really do reproduction in two of them. In malaria, the sexual stage, the definitive host, is the mosquito. And malaria does a very neat thing in the mosquito. It not only does sexual reproduction, but it does what we would recognize as male-female reproduction. When we get to reproduction as a system, I'll tell you what male and female really means biologically. But it's determined by sex cells, by sperm and egg cells. In a mosquito, some of the malaria act like egg cells and some of the malaria act like sperm cells. So it does this sexual reproduction that's kind of a male-female dance. And then the offspring invade the salivary glands of the mosquito. Mosquito lands on the host, it lands on you, sticks its little needle nose through your skin, and a long tube snakes out trying to find a blood vessel. It's really tough to pull blood through a little tube. The turbulence will immediately clot it unless you do something. So before it does any kind of sucking of blood, it spits an anticoagulant down the tube, and saliva comes out the end. Malaria comes out with it, and it goes right into your bloodstream because it's poked into a blood vessel. It circulates, not for long though, but long enough that your immune system gets a look at it and goes, okay, we need to make antibodies to these guys. Within a half an hour, any malaria introduced into your blood is no longer in your blood. It has invaded your liver cells, where it reproduces, but it doesn't produce much in the way of damage. And so it was a big mystery for a long time because the exposure to the actual symptoms could be a short time or a really long time, and nobody really knew what it was doing in the meantime. Because in experimental birds, they use birds because mice don't get malaria, but birds do. And they'd inject the birds with huge gobs of malaria, and then it would disappear, and it's like, where the heck did it go? It took a very long time to find that it was reproducing in liver cells because it wasn't really doing much damage to the liver. So it was hard to find. Anyway, in some people, it never emerges from the liver. But if you're going to get malaria, the disease, its second stage is it comes out of the liver cells into your blood and invades your red blood cells, single malaria cells into your red blood cells. But now it's out and free, and your immune system is going, let's get it. But it's coming out in this huge wave all at once. And so your immune system overreacts. Inflammation all over your body, heats you up, high fever, cooks your brain, doesn't literally cook your brain, but if the fever gets high enough, your brain doesn't function real well. And the symptoms that we associate with malaria, that are the symptoms that essentially kill you, are actually mostly from your own immune reaction, your own immune overreaction. They will deplete your red blood cells after a while. They will potentially give you anemia, but that doesn't often kill somebody. But the heat and and a few other things is what really can kill you from malaria. And then what's happening is they're hoping that your blood gets picked up by the next mosquito, where it's going to do its next stage of reproduction. It asexually reproduces in your liver and blood cells, and it sexually is going to reproduce in the next mosquito. There's a related, well, in the same basic group, Toxoplasma. Toxoplasma is typically a parasite of intestinal cells in cats. It can live in a few other animals, but the offspring pass in cat feces. So if you have a cat and you're exposed to the cat span, you in theory can be exposed to Toxoplasma. Toxoplasma not crazy about living in people. So even if you're around cats your whole life, for a while they, I'll explain why in a second, but for a while they were running antibody tests for Toxoplasma on women that were pregnant or looking to get pregnant. And they found that women that have been around cats their whole lives very, very rarely had antibodies to it. And also, it turns out the antibodies are kind of a useless test. Let me take you step by step. It's hard for it to get from cat fecal material into a person and survive long enough to be there. If it does get into a person, it may invade some of your nerve cells, where it just kind of sits unless something happens to your immune system, because your immune system won't let it back out. But other than that, it doesn't seem to do much, although there's some question lately as to whether it may cause some brain issues in people after it's been there for a few years. But in order for the danger that everybody was worried about in pregnant women to happen, it needs to persist in the body long enough to cross the blood barrier into an embryo's blood system. It doesn't do that very easily. That's tough for it to do. It's got to be doing it in the first trimester, early in the embryo's development, when the nervous system is first starting to develop. And it needs to interfere with that development. So that's a whole sequence of steps that does not happen. Each one is kind of rare. So yes, it can cause birth defects in some babies if it gets in them at the wrong time in the wrong place. But the odds of it doing that For a while, they were telling women, oh, you shouldn't have your cats if you're gonna get pregnant, or, I mean, when my wife got pregnant, before I looked all this stuff up, they said, oh, my wife and I used to do our cat's pans. She'd do it, I'd do it, she'd do it, I'd do it, and then she didn't do it, because I did it. I think my son was 25 before I stopped being the only one that did it. Anyway, but here's the other thing about toxoplasma. You can also get it from, it's very rare to get it from cats, but it is not that rare to get it in meat. It can be carried in pigs, especially. If you know anybody that eats mutton, it can be carried in mutton. It's unusual in lamb, but it can be carried in mutton. It's unusual in beef. But the most likely exposure for toxoplasma is pork. It's way more common as an exposure in the United States than getting it from cats. And a few years ago, they used to always cook the pork because there was a worm parasite we'll talk about that you wanted to kill by cooking it. And they got that pretty much under control, so they kind of relaxed the cooking requirements. The government, U.S., I don't forget what agriculture department I think controls this. So it was allowed that you could cook and serve pink pork instead of white, make the meat white, which would kill the worms. Well, it turns out pink doesn't kill these guys. And for some reason, whoever got into a room to make the decision, nobody in the room knew about toxoplasma. So we actually have way more cases of toxoplasmosis in the country than we used to, because pink pork has become a thing. So if you're someplace getting pork and they serve a pink, send it back. Tell them, cook it. Is it? I remember being in a restaurant going, no, this has got to be fully cooked. Is that there's toxoplasma in this? And she goes, oh, we get our pigs from local farmers. I'm thinking, well, then definitely cook it, because it could have trichinosis in it too, the worm. Is that we really control the other parasite through factory farming. I'll talk about that when we get to roundworms. So, okay, I'm just looking. I thought I had another protozoan on my list, but I do not. So that's it for the protozoans.